It's really a big pleasure to join you today and the other incredible panelists. So I will share a short presentation to try to support my short intervention today. Can everyone see my screen? Yeah, good. Um, yeah, so why did we come together under an alliance, right? And who we are in terms of the Sport and Rights Alliance. It was really in the back-to-back mega sporting events that we received in my home country, in Brazil, both the World Cup and then the Olympics, just like the United States will be hosting now this year with the 2026 World Cup, and then in 2 years, the LA Summer Olympics. And we saw that there were many impacts around the event, right? Just like in South Africa, Beijing, all the previous World Cups as well. But here in Brazil, we saw mass protests in the streets. At the time, it was also the moment where the previous World Cup in 2010 had been in South Africa, with issues around forced evictions, right to protests. And in 2010, so 4 years before Brazil hosted the World Cup, we also saw Qatar winning the bid to host the 2022 World Cup. So there was a series of events around that time that culminated into human rights being really at the center of the debate when it comes to mega sporting events. At the same time, we saw that inside sports, there was also a lot of talks about human rights. So be it, African women's soccer team talking about systemic abuse within sports, to Iranian women demanding their right to enter stadiums, and women wearing the hijab, also demanding their right to play within basketball and football. So we came together as an alliance with global civil society organizations, trade unions, really trying to come together to promote the rights and well-being of those most impacted by sports, and to bring about a world where sports is an authentic force for good. We really believe in sports and in the power that sports have, but only, and that is very important, only if it's done with human rights at the center. So we have 4 different goals. This is the way we structure our work. So the first one is around policy. So trying to look at systemic change at the governance level of global sports governing bodies. So we focus on FIFA, but also the International Olympic Committee and UEFA as global sports governing bodies. We look at events, so from the bidding phase, so whether human rights and labor rights were taken into account when those events were awarded, but also throughout its implementation and legacy. We also take on board specific individual cases when they are strategic and they are able to advance, the policy goals. And we also think about our movement and the sport and human rights movement, and how it is super important that progressive movements look at sports, because we are seeing how the ultra-right is already taking sports as hostage and advancing very, very damaging policies through sports. And we feel that our movement, within civil society organizations, we also need to occupy this space with our agendas and with human rights and labor rights. So that's why we see the movement as also one of our goals. So human rights at FIFA. Going back a little bit, and how did that happen? So when we came together in 2015, FIFA didn't even recognize it had human rights responsibilities, right? So in 2011, we had the UN Guiding Principles being adopted with, the Ruggie principles and the 3 pillars of the state's duty to protect, the business's responsibility to respect, And both shared responsibility to provide remedy, which is also the forgotten pillar, because remedy is really lagging behind the other two pillars. And at the time when we came together as the Sporting Rights Alliance, this was the first big ask in terms of policy, because really none of the big sports governing bodies saw themselves as businesses. So they didn't even think they had any responsibility. And because of the events that I mentioned before, Qatar being awarded the 2022 World Cup, the mass protests in Brazil, and also the Barolac arrest that we've witnessed with the money laundering and racketeering in 2015 in Switzerland, and people really being caught, arrested from FIFA officials. It culminated into change, right? And one of those changes was Article 3 within the FIFA statutes that actually recognizes human rights as part of their responsibilities. That meant that for the first time in the 2026 Men's World Cup was going to have human rights from the bidding process until its implementation. So we saw the bid book from Canada, Mexico, and US having human rights enshrined in it. We can't affirm how much human rights was taken into account in the decision process, but it is in the bid book, and it has been since the bidding process part of the analysis. But what has that really changed in practice? And very little, right? From what we've seen so far in terms of implementation and main risks around the Men's World Cup, we're seeing, militarization of public security, as we've seen in many events. I have to point out that this is not new. In my home country, in Brazil, this is the only legacy you can see from the back-to-back mega sporting events, is the military in the streets, right? In Rio de Janeiro, that is what we have as a legacy. And that's what we're seeing again rolled out in 2026. So in the US, we're seeing, according to Human Rights Watch Reporters Guide, ICE has arrested more than 90,000 people in only 9 months in 2025 in the 11 host cities in the US. Freedom of movement, so the travel bans, risks to fans, athletes, journalists, especially LGBTI population, is very high. And overall authoritarian practices on crackdowns on peaceful protests and freedom of speech is what we're seeing as a result of this World Cup. What has been FIFA's response, you might ask, taking into account that FIFA had all of those documents that they should be, having a clear line when it comes to human rights. But no, we're seeing the opposite, right? We're seeing FIFA handing over a so-called peace prize. So institutionalizing sports washing. Before, we had seen governments using mega sporting events to sports wash their image. Now we're seeing FIFA as a sports governing body handing out awards, and so themselves promoting sports washing. The whole city action plans, which were, enshrined since the bidding phase, that they had to be released. What we're seeing as a result is there have been too little, too late. So out of the 16 host cities, only Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, and Vancouver have published plans, and these are not at all to the standard that we hoped they would be. We can go into detail later. FIFA's anti-discrimination campaigns released just 2 weeks ago. They failed to address risks by LGBTI population. They don't mention them at all. So even though we have called out FIFA to release and continue the anti-discrimination campaigns that they had not done during the Club World Cup last year, so it's a good thing they have those campaigns now, but they're not addressing one of the main groups that are at risk during the World Cup. And finally, the lack of a reporting mechanism. Until now, FIFA has not published the reporting mechanisms. We're only weeks away. A reporting mechanism should have been released at the start when the US, Mexico, and Canada were awarded, because that's when the risks actually start to happen and when real impact happens to people, communities. And so we're already losing all of this time. And even 2 weeks before the tournament, the grievance mechanism is not there. So human rights may not be properly accounted for, responded, or addressed. So that's why we are partnering with Unifor to monitor the risks during and the impact during the World Cup. So we have key objectives with this partnership. So is to raise accountability, to raise the point that FIFA has a responsibility as a sports governing body. It's tricky when it comes to mega sporting events because governments are involved, sponsors are involved, sports governing bodies, but they all have a responsibility in different ways. And we want to make sure people know that FIFA has that. We also want to document abuses, and that is important not only for this tournament, but also looking forward to LA, for instance, and to future World Cups. We know that US is also bidding to host the 2031 Women's World Cup. So how will that happen when we document what will happen during this World Cup? And finally, to drive reform, right? As I mentioned, the Sporting Rights Alliance, one of our first calls was to embed human rights in the statutes. What has that meant in practice? Very little. What needs to happen? What other policies, governance structures needs to change within FIFA so that we don't see this happening in the future again? And so before the tournament, we have already started with a campaign, public campaign to raise awareness, fan mobilization. So we are Football Supporters Europe is part of our coalition, and we have a close partnership with them and with Independent Supporters Council, which is a North America fans group. We'll also promote press conferences to make sure that journalists covering the World Cup are also aware of human rights and labor rights issues around the event. And we'll also promote a network of correspondents within our remit of alliance so that they can report any abuse inside and outside the stadiums to inform our report. During the World Cup, we have agreed already on a reactive response protocol within our members. And then we'll have real-time monitoring of human rights violations and detentions, which we're treating a bit different because of the emergency around detentions that might happen around the event. And finally, in terms of post-tournament accountability and reform, as I mentioned, we'll write all of this in a report and continue our advocacy both with FIFA and the International Olympic Committee to make sure that we're able to bring about systemic change and avoid this from happening again in the future. And finally, just wanted to conclude as a reminder that, sports mirrors our society. It can be an authentic force for good, but it can also cause and exacerbate injustices and abuses that we see throughout our society. And finally, that sports belongs to all of us. It belongs to all the athletes that dedicate their whole lives to performance, to every fan that brings their passion into every worker that makes it possible. When it comes to mega sporting events like FIFA and the World Cup, we tend to forget that sports belongs to all of us because there is this monopoly of those big organizations organizing it, but it takes on us to demand more of them. So I invite everyone to join our movement, join the Sport and Rights Alliance, and really together we can hold them accountable and really change sports for the better. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here. I'm happy to answer any questions and to stick around to continue the conversation.